Welcome to Character Analysis, the podcast where I play armchair psychologist and internet detective, and I try to figure out why people do the messy, ridiculous, and sometimes disturbing things that they do. In today's episode, I want to talk about a new kind of psychological warfare, and it's not one that plays out on any kind of battlefield. It's one that happens behind the screens of our devices. It's called digital abuse. And this is when technology gets used to control, stalk, or otherwise mess with someone, like reading their text messages, tracking their location with an app. Digital abuse can happen to anybody. Unfortunately, it's most often weaponized against women, especially women who have or maintain some kind of online presence or social media following. That's what makes today's story so crazy. Millennial social worker Francesca was the opposite of chronically online. She didn't use social media to stay in touch with people or to connect with people. Because of her job, she had to be very careful about what she revealed online and off. If you wanted to communicate with her, you couldn't even Google her. She just wasn't accessible, and that was by design. Francesca was not some aspiring influencer. She was a regular person who was being systematically targeted. Somebody was using technology to ruin Francesca's life. And it all started innocently enough with an email from an ex-boyfriend. At the time she received the message, Francesca was in a new relationship. Things were going well. She didn't feel the need to reopen the lines of communication with this ex, so she didn't respond. A couple months later, another ex-boyfriend sent a message to check in. Francesca didn't think anything of this because their breakups were amicable. It didn't seem strange that somebody might want to say hello and see how she's doing. Francesca was still dating the same guy. Things were still going really well. So she didn't respond to this ex-boyfriend either. It was when she got a message on her work phone that she started to get a little nervous. This message was from the girlfriend of one of her ex-boyfriends. And attached to the message was a naked picture of Francesca. Obviously, Francesca panicked because she couldn't understand why this woman was being so malicious. But more concerning was Francesca couldn't figure out where this woman got this naked photo of her. A few weeks later, she gets a call from a good friend of hers. And the friend says, "Listen, I just got a Facebook friend request from your ex-boyfriend. And their profile photo is a naked picture of you." Now Francesca is fully panicked. She can't have these kinds of images floating around the internet. This went from personal communication to something a lot more public. And she needed to get to the bottom of this before this affected her reputation and her career. Francesca met with an attorney named Carrie Goldberg. Carrie was one of the first lawyers in New York City to handle what was then referred to as revenge porn. Carrie was so good at this that she wrote a book that I'm going to link in the show notes. Francesca brought all the messages, all the attachments, and she gave everything to Carrie. Because this was Carrie's wheelhouse, she knew what kind of signs to look for. So she dug in and started researching this ex-boyfriend. And that included doing a background search, while her associate looked into all of his social media profiles. Right away, Carrie knew something wasn't right. She wasn't seeing any of the signs that she typically saw in cases like this. She was looking for some kind of emotional upheaval, some kind of trigger, a stressor. But this guy didn't have one. He had his life together. Thankfully, she was able to get the Facebook profile taken down. And Francesca thought she could breathe a sigh of relief. Well, that was short-lived. She received a message from a law firm. A woman had hired this law firm to represent her in a lawsuit against Francesca. The woman was the ex-wife of Francesca's ex-boyfriend. And she claimed that Francesca was responsible for giving her herpes. Francesca opened the attached file, read the document. It all sounded legit, and she was terrified. Back to Carrie she went, and she brought the document and the messages, and Carrie said she was gonna look into it. She gave the PDF file that was attached to the message to her associate, and she asked him to do a little digging. And while he did that, she called the law firm because the law firm on the letterhead was real, as was the lawyer whose name was on the document. She spoke to the lawyer, and the lawyer said, "I don't know what you're talking about. This sounds like a practical joke." Her associate came back to her and told her that he looked into the PDF file that was attached to the message, and he did some analysis of its metadata. Now, metadata is information that is embedded in a file that can tell you where a picture or a document was created, what time, what location. And in the case of documents, it can tell you the last person who updated or edited the file. According to her associate, the person to edit the file last was named Juan Thompson. This name did not ring any bells with Carrie, so they just continued to dig until they found something. Carrie's associate called Francesca at work and told her to hang up her cell phone and call him back from a landline, which, of course, she thought was weird, but she did it. And he said, "You need to turn your phone off and you need to come to the law firm right now. You can't tell anybody where you're going. You can't turn your phone back on. Don't send any texts. You just need to get here." Francesca leaves work. She gets to the law firm and she's immediately taken to the conference room. Carrie's in there, and on the conference table next to her are a bunch of documents and some photos. Carrie points to one of the photos of Juan Thompson and she asks Francesca, "Do you know this guy?" And Francesca says, "Yeah, that's my boyfriend." The messages from her ex-boyfriends, the naked photo on Facebook, the fake lawsuit, the person behind all of it was her live-in boyfriend, Juan Thompson. Now Francesca was faced with not just having to break up with Juan, but to get him out of her apartment because he'd moved in with her. She called him and told him that it was over, things weren't working out, and he left. Once all the pieces fell into place, Francesca realized that Juan was able to pose as her ex-boyfriends and got those naked photos because he'd had access to her journals, to her emails, to her texts. He knew so much more about Francesca than she'd realized, including what her vulnerabilities were. This was how he was able to charm everybody in her life and present himself as sort of her ideal partner. He knew what kind of man Francesca was looking for, and that's who he became. But when his multiple attempts to try and work things out with Francesca were unsuccessful, that's when Juan got angry. He began trying to poison her reputation. He contacted her boss and pretended to be a journalist from ABC, claiming Francesca was buying alcohol for minors and sleeping with her clients. Francesca repeatedly went to the police trying to get some kind of restraining order or charges filed, and they couldn't do anything. One day, Francesca was at work and she got a call from a sergeant saying they'd received an email from her telling them that she was going to bomb the 77th precinct. Francesca knew it was Juan. Then they got a death threat that was made against Francesca and the NYPD chief of police. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received a tip that Francesca had child pornography on her phone. Police showed up at Francesca's door because they'd received a tip that Francesca was selling guns from her apartment, and every single time she told them, "This is Juan Thompson." Carrie was especially concerned because Juan's behavior and his harassment and the abuse, it was escalating very quickly. More concerning was that they couldn't find him. As it turns out, he was using about 25 different devices to text, call, and email Francesca and all these other people. Then one night, the FBI showed up at her apartment, and said that she'd been implicated in a bomb threat to a Jewish community center. She gave the agents the file she'd been compiling on Juan and told them everything. Finally, somebody listened. Juan was arrested and he got 5 years in federal prison. Juan Thompson is what I would call a narrative addict. A narrative addict is somebody who's psychologically dependent on controlling how they're perceived by other people, to the extent that they have to control that narrative and control other people's perception of them at all times. It's a very heightened version of main character syndrome. You'll see a narrative addict, these tendencies are often linked to narcissism. That's because narcissists tend to construct a facade, a false self, a mask. Their personas are highly curated to the point where if that facade cracks, they will do anything to protect it. And we saw that with Juan. We saw how far he was willing to go to protect that mask, to protect the narrative. Social media is a narrative addict as well as a narcissist playground, because social media allows the narrative addict to curate versions of reality in real time. And it also allows them to erase accountability with just by deleting a post or by editing something that they uploaded. Why they really thrive on social media is because the likes, the shares, the sympathy, the attention, the gushing, it gives them the dopamine that they need that keeps the addiction alive. If you want to know if you're dealing with a narrative addict, something to look for is there inconsistency in their stories, and do their stories always paint them in the best light? Do they shift roles from hero to victim depending on what's going to get them sympathy? Very common among narrative addicts is they blame their haters or their jealous exes instead of taking accountability for something. They always need an audience, whether it's friends, followers, whoever. And when someone challenges their version of events, they don't defend themselves. Their first course of action is to attack the challenger's credibility. Narrative addicts like Juan cast the people around them in roles in their made up narratives. Juan cast Francesca as a bit of a damsel in distress. Francesca tells a story of a conversation she was having with Juan when she was getting these messages and finding out about these naked photos. And Juan said to her, "What kind of guys did you date before me? You must be so glad that you're dating me now." Out of context, right? If we don't know the whole story, that a statement like that sounds so innocent. But add context to it, and it's actually really sinister, because what he's doing there is he's painting Francesca as the damsel in distress, somebody who needed to be saved. And of course, he's the savior. He's the hero. He wasn't satisfied with just being a good guy. He needed to elevate himself to savior status. Juan wasn't just a narrative addict in his personal relationships. Juan was a journalist. He worked for a website called The Intercept. He was fired for fabricating sources. Even in his job, he had to curate a narrative and sell a narrative, which I'm sure ultimately was about him exposing the bad guy, right? Him being the one to call out the bad guy. This is where we get to the engine behind the narrative addiction. What's really fueling it? Because a narrative isn't just something that an addict tells. It's something that they enforce. That's where psychological abuse comes into play. One of the most devastating aspects of this experience for Francesca was that She was a social worker. She was trained, she was educated to spot maladaptive behavior. But with Juan, she didn't see it. That's because in the beginning of their relationship, he made himself, he twisted himself into a version of an ideal partner. This is where the mental manipulation comes in. Narrative addicts, they don't know how to self-soothe. Their self-image, their sense of self depends on external validation, which is why they have to create a cast of characters and push a certain narrative in order to feel good about themselves. Francesca was so frustrated that she didn't see through Juan sooner. But what she probably realizes now is abusers like Juan are exceptionally skilled at conning people. She didn't see through it because he didn't want her to. Juan positioned himself as sort of the perfect guy because he wasn't content just being a good guy. He needed to be better than all the other men Francesca had ever met. His ego wouldn't settle for less. Narrative addicts rely on mental manipulation, specifically psychological abuse, because once they have their target or their victim completely enamored with them, they need to strip that person of their sense of reality and their sense of self so that if they need to change the narrative, they can, and there won't be much pushback. This is where grooming or love bombing comes in. We hear love bombing a lot, especially when it comes to discussions or conversations about narcissists. Love bombing is when somebody pours on not just the charm, but the attention and the affection. They sweep people off their feet. They want their target to become not just emotionally dependent on them, but there's a neurobiological component here that I'm not really sure abusers like Juan understand, but the more they pour on the affection and attention, the more dependent somebody becomes, which means more oxytocin gets produced, which means that oxytocin, which we commonly know it as the love drug, what that oxytocin actually does is reinforce a bond and make it stronger. When somebody is feeling seen, the way Francesca felt seen, not only are they producing that oxytocin, but they're producing that dopamine. So eventually, they become dependent on that rush that they're feeling from the dopamine, and that oxytocin has strengthened that bond so much that it's made it very difficult for the victim to be able to leave, which is the point, because once that bond is reinforced and strong enough, that's when the physical abuser turns to devaluation. And this is when things get really scary. This is what makes psychological abuse so insidious, is that devaluation is often very, very subtle, and it starts very slow, which is why we don't typically catch on to it. This is where the hot and cold behavior comes in. This is where the gaslighting starts. And this is where the victim starts questioning themselves. That's exactly where a narrative addict like Juan wanted Francesca, because that meant she'd be more willing to believe whatever narrative he pushed. Remember, he got fired, and that's why he moved in with her. You can only imagine what story he told her. But whatever it was, she was probably willing to believe it because he had done such a masterful job of mentally manipulating her. Remember that comment that Juan made to Francesca about her previous boyfriends? Geez, what kind of men did you date before me? You must be so glad that you're with me. He wasn't teasing her. He was planting a seed. He was planting a seed of doubt in her mind because he wanted her to start questioning not just her judgment, but her intuition. This kind of psychological abuse, it's intended to destabilize the victim's sense of reality. Because once they start questioning their reality, the abuser can come in and clarify what's actually going on. Only what they're saying, the narrative that they're pushing isn't accurate. But their victim doesn't know that. Getting their victim to question themselves and to question their sense of reality, it allows them to reestablish authorship of the narrative. And this typically happens when the abuser, when the narrative addict feels as though they're losing control. Psychological abuse is how narrative addicts keep control of the story. They use gaslighting, projection, confusion. It's all in their toolbox that they use to rewrite a narrative when they have to. And the scariest part is the victim doesn't even realize that they've been cast in this show until they're already in it. Francesca wasn't just a player in one of Juan's narratives, of one of his plays. She became a reoccurring character in two. Because remember, when they broke up, now Francesca knew everything that Juan had been doing. And Juan could not risk Francesca telling people that they knew and that truth getting out there. So what did he do? He did what he could to poison her credibility and her reputation. By making all of these threats via email and making all these calls to her boss and to police precincts, he wasn't just trying to hurt Francesca. He was creating evidence that he could point to in his new narrative that, oh my God, my ex-girlfriend, she's crazy. Juan was willing to go to great lengths to destroy Francesca's reputation and her life. And that's because she was able to prove that who he was projecting to the world, that it was all a facade. And to a narrative addict, to a psychological abuser like Juan, to a narcissist, that is the worst possible outcome of a situation like that. Because remember, they don't know how to self-soothe. It's all about public perception. It's all about external validation. And if they don't have that, then people will start to see them how they truly see themselves, which is usually damaged, broken, bad in some way. The entire facade was constructed to prevent them from having to be alone with themselves, having to face their own issues. Technology played such a huge role in this case, which makes sense because digital spaces are the best places for people like Juan to maintain their narratives. See, Francesca could avoid this guy offline, right? She could just shut him out, she could block his number, she could move, she could do all kinds of things. But online, she could never really avoid him, and she could never really know how to prevent or stop this because she never knew where he was. He was able to hide his location, he was able to hide his identity because of technology. Juan didn't just use technology to woo Francesca. He went through her phone, he went through her texts, he went through online spaces, anywhere where she may have been writing anything personal, and he was able to get all kinds of information to use to his advantage. But he was also able to keep the relationship going on his terms well after Francesca ended things. What better way to prevent Francesca from moving on, from meeting somebody new, than to occupy her thoughts with these threats? As long as Juan continued to hold these threats over her head, as long as Juan continued to maintain some kind of presence in her life, Francesca couldn't move on. And he was able to do that through making burner profiles, through comments or posts on social media spaces. He didn't need a phone to reach any of these people. He could just go through a contact form on a website. He didn't have to show up at a precinct. It was determined that Juan had been using, I think it was well over 20 or 25 different devices to carry out these threats and to carry out this digital abuse, which meant that it would be very difficult for people to track his IP or block his IP. Juan could be whoever he wanted online. He could create characters in this particular story that could support his claims against Francesca. In 2025, it's incredibly easy to create a fictional digital trail, fake screenshots, fake profiles. That's what makes it so difficult to hold people accountable for this kind of abuse. The irony is, Juan used technology to woo and terrorize Francesca, but it was also technology that got him caught. Because remember, Carrie Goldberg had her associate go through that PDF file, and the associate went into the metadata where he was able to find out the last person who had updated that PDF file that the fake lawyer sent to Francesca. Like most narcissists, they all think they're smarter than everybody else, and they always trip up in the most basic ways. Francesca took this experience and she channeled it into helping other people. She founded a nonprofit called Thriving Through. Thriving Through is a therapeutic practice that specializes in working with those who have experienced digital violence or technology facilitated abuse and intimate partner violence. If you want to learn more about Thriving Through, you can go to worldwithoutexploitation.org. There are some steps that you can take to minimize the chances of digital abuse. The first one is make sure you're using two-factor authentication wherever it's offered. Make sure you create unique passwords for everything, for every login, whether it's Netflix, whether it's your email. Have different passwords for everything. And you can get a notebook on Amazon that's just for passwords, and keep it somewhere safe. And I wouldn't keep your password list on your computer. Put it in a notebook and hide the notebook somewhere. Audit your privacy settings on social media. Make sure you know who can view things, who can tag you, who can message you, and who can't. Add your name to a Google alert so that you can be aware if somebody creates a profile in your name. Try to Google yourself regularly without getting too paranoid about it, because more than the chances that someone might steal your identity, if they always exist, but if you're vigilant about it, it minimizes the risk. So Google yourself every few months just to see what's out there. Also, make sure to buy your vanity URL, especially if you have a unique name, meaning first name, last name. Always make sure to have separate email accounts, one for personal, one for business, one for financial or banking. As tempting as it might be to engage with an internet troll, the truth is you just don't know. You don't know who's just a troll and who's somebody who's mentally unbalanced, who could potentially be dangerous. That's why the better choice is just do not engage, but absolutely screenshot everything. Then make sure to back up all of the evidence and the screenshots on some kind of external hard drive. And of course, block and report, but don't block until you get all the screenshots. You might also want to let people in your inner circle, people that you trust, let them in on anything that might be going on. Let them know that you have somebody out there who's kind of a little fixated on you and they seem a little too intent on bringing you down. So if you get any weird messages, if you get any weird emails, please make sure to tell me. To prevent this kind of abuse within a relationship, whether it's a friendship, a work relationship, or a romantic relationship, always be aware of this need for transparency. Regardless of the context of the relationship, you are never obligated to share your passwords or give somebody any kind of access to your online world. Be very careful who you let into your online spaces. And that includes people on dating apps who try to pressure you into giving them your social media pages. You're not obligated to do that. And if they push for it, take that as a red flag. Also, make note if someone's sort of constantly checking on you and where you are, not just what location, but what you're doing, and they do it under the guise of just wanting to make sure you're safe. That's usually someone who's trying to control you. They want to know where you are at all times. And if you set boundaries with these types of people and they get mad, don't don't get there are no second chances. That anger when you set a boundary is the only red flag you need that that person is toxic. I want to thank you for listening. If you have any ideas for future episodes, please send me an email to Chris, Chris, at mycharacteranalysis.com. Make sure you're following me on all the socials, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, at My Character Analysis. Make sure to subscribe to my Substack where I write additional articles or create other content about the episodes, as well as maintain the Mind Matters space where we talk about mental health and ADHD. And I discuss my own personal journey with these things. And if you want the behind the scenes content, the bonus videos, the bonus podcast episodes, go to patreon.com/mycharacteranalysis and subscribe. This is a bi-weekly podcast, mainly because my ADHD does not allow me to create episodes every single week. But I do publish mini Mind Matter episodes every other week in between the main episodes. So make sure you're following me on Spotify and make sure you're following me on Substack so you can stay up to date with those episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.